Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 4 of The Left Unsaid, where we mine the headlines and piles of academic writing to bring you only the shiniest gems and leave the rest in the slag heap. I am Patrick McElwee, and I'm joined by my son,
Finn McElwee.
And we are missing our best third. She is currently in Memphis with my daughter, Finn's sister, who's at a dance conference. So just the two of us today.
Yep.
Back to the origins of the whole project. We actually we'll tell you about it. We did a podcast episode way back when, just the two of us. So this is how we started. But we're going to get Meg back next week, so not to worry out there. So I thought we might start talking, Finn, in this episode about Gaza. We've talked about it in the last 3 episodes, but we haven't really talked about why it matters to us. And I think some people out there who are listened, certainly there's some people out there who are listening will have understood because they also care about Gaza. But I do think that there's a large percentage of people who don't really understand why some of us care so much about it. Because after all, there's wars going on all over the world, all the time. And one critique that gets leveled at people in the United States and around the world who care about Israel and Palestine and who aren't Jewish or Arab and don't live there is the question of why do you care? I think in everyday life for a lot of people, Israel-Gaza doesn't get talked about all that much. And people might be a little bit surprised by the intensity of feeling if they're not following this closely and they haven't really thought about it. What do you feel like is the vibe among young people in your high school?
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't really get talked about that much. There's some discussion maybe on the periphery a little bit, but it's kind of, a taboo almost subject. People just don't really see it as super important to talk about.
And it feels dangerous to talk about a lot of the times.
Yeah.
So I thought we'd take a moment to just explain to people who might be listening to us, it might be friends and family, and might not completely understand why this is such an important issue. And it's not just another war somewhere far away. Not that any war is just another war. I mean, I think we ought to care anytime that people are being killed and maimed in large numbers. And, these are not opinions that we've come to lightly, right? Back in 2023, so, after October 7th, Finn, you and I actually did a podcast that we put up on YouTube that anybody can find. Back then, I thought that the topics were going to be a little bit lighter in general. We didn't intend to talk about Gaza so much as we were planning that podcast series, which we ended up abandoning pretty quickly. So it was called Playfully Serious, I believe. So if you look for Playfully Serious on YouTube, you can find like an hour-long podcast that you and I did where we talked about Israel and Palestine. And I think we were trying pretty hard to be even-handed about it, but we were doing a deep dive on the history between Israel and Palestine.
Yeah.
And since then, even I think beginning then, but since then, the horrors of what's happened in Gaza have just slammed home, and it's gone so far that, I mean, if anyone looks at before and after images of Gaza, you have a thriving city and then just rubble. It's unrecognizable as a city. Just looks like footage of Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the atomic bombs were dropped. So I would say one reason that people care a lot about what's happening in Gaza is just the sheer horror of it. We've just seen such horrific images. If you're paying attention, if you're not censoring your feed, and I understand most people probably are, it's horrific to see the kinds of things that are coming out of there. But I mean, to see parents holding the heads of their children, right? Their decapitated heads, or to see a girl who's hanging from a wall and the lower half of her is just shredded. I saw a dad performing an amputation on his daughter's leg while she was awake. Just absolutely horrific things that are only scratching the surface of what has become daily life for the 2 million people who were living in Gaza. I mean, it's just horrific. And obviously, this kind of horror isn't exclusive to Gaza. There's horrors happening right now in the Sudan, for example. There's horrors happening right now in Ukraine. And as human beings, we respond with sympathy and solidarity to other human beings faced with this kind of torment. What makes Gaza more urgent for those of us who are addressing it is that our government is supporting and funding it. And this is a huge amount of money, billions and billions of dollars.
We're basically financing Israel's whole campaign in Gaza.
And it's hard to get a feel for just how big a number these billions of dollars are, but it's a lot, right? We're literally sending the bombs that are killing these kids. 2,000-pound
bombs to be dropped on one of the most densely populated areas on the planet.
And not only that, but providing political cover that's allowing Israel to continue this despite almost unanimous international criticism, despite all the attempts within the United Nations and with other bodies of international law to make it stop. The United States is using its weight, and it used it under the Democratic administration, and now it's using it under the Republican administration to prevent international law from restraining Israel from continuing what has very clearly become a campaign of ethnic cleansing in Gaza, where they want to take the land and clear all the Palestinians off of that land. I think those two things get brought up a lot. But the third thing is that what Israel is doing and what the United States is doing by backing it is violating the hard-won rules that have been built up over centuries, the international law that I would say are the rules of civilization, that are one of the things that protects us from our own capacity for violence and barbarity toward each other. And by doing this, they're threatening all of us because we're all protected by the rules of how human beings can treat each other on this planet. You know, I'm reading a fantastic new book by Greg Grandin. He's a historian at Yale. It's a great book. It's a history of the New World, and it's one of these fantastic sweeping histories that starts back at the very beginning when Europeans first encountered the New World, when Columbus first landed on Hispaniola. I highly recommend this book. It's called America, America. So just the word America once in a funny Spanish accent, which is a great title because it's really the ambiguity of what America means and has meant different things at different times in different places. A lot of times right now in the United States, we tend to say America and think that means just the United States of America. But there's a long history of America, and even America, as said by people here in the North, to mean the entire continent from Canada all the way down to Argentina.
Yeah, the Gulf of America.
Yeah, in that context, the Gulf of America just sounds great. Maybe it's more ecumenical. It's no longer just North America. We're inviting in the South Americans too. What strikes me are the similarities of what's happened before when one group of people has seen another as disposable, as able to be violently attacked and expelled. You know, back in the 1500s when Spain first sent its conquistadors to the Caribbean, to Mexico and South America, these places were heavily populated. The first accounts of the explorers who arrived in these places said that they were just these lush societies with farming happening, with bustling communities, living in relative abundance. And the violence that the Spanish conquistadors unleashed was just absolutely sickening. I mean, just worse than the most terrible horror movie. Mutilations, burning people alive, babies torn apart by dogs, the people of entire villages, entire regions starved and worked to death. It's easy to say. It's hard to contemplate. All of these things came accompanied, of course, by plague, but it wasn't just plague. People literally did this to other human beings and decimated the Indians. It's estimated that they killed 9 out of every 10 person living in the Americas before the encounter.
Wow.
You know, and they justified it to themselves in all kinds of ways, just as Israel and its supporters justify what they're doing in Gaza. You know, it strikes me one of the main ways they would do it is they would cite any small little incitement of the Indians towards them, like any attempt of the Indians to defend themselves or maybe to counterattack. And it's just like, okay, hold me back. You know, everything is legitimate now.
Sounds familiar.
This is like the Braveheart principle of human relationships. I don't know if you've seen the Braveheart movie.
I've not, no.
Mel Gibson loves this genre of movie. It's like the revenge porn where something will happen, something terrible will happen. And I feel a lot of times Mel Gibson is playing like the underdog. And because the oppressor has done something, it justifies all of the violence that happens in the rest of the movie. And the movie is just like an unending orgy of violence. Well, that's a lot of what happened there. And I feel like that's what's happening in Gaza. You had October 7th, which obviously included some very sickening acts. People were killed in large numbers, something that we do not support, something that sickens us.
Yeah, no one should support.
And it has been followed up by violence on just a completely different order of magnitude that just swamps what happened on October 7th and continues. And October 7th just gets invoked and invoked over and over and over, even though October 7th is happening like every month in Gaza or every week in Gaza.
Yeah. I mean, if you just look at the numbers, it's ridiculous to say, somewhere around 1,200 people were killed on October 7th. That's including both members of the IDF and civilians. And if you just look at the number of children that have been killed in Gaza, it's 10, 14 times that number, which how anyone's arguing that this was an apt response, I have no idea.
Yeah. And, what strikes me reading this book by Professor Grandin, America, is we're not the first people to live stream a genocide. There's a guy back in the time of the Spanish conquest. His name's Bartolomé de las Casas. He was a Spanish priest, and he actually took part in some of the horrors of the conquest and later apologized and recanted. And he wrote books detailing the horrors that he saw in the New World.
So these are some of the only records that we have.
He's not the only one. I mean, it's quite amazing that during the conquest itself, there were all of these Catholic clerics, priests and monks and others who articulated a real critique of what was happening in the New World. They started to build what I think we would call today humanism, which is the idea that all of humanity is one, and that the Indians that they encountered were also humans. It's a horrific thing to have to live stream something like this and to feel powerless to stop it. It's taken a real toll on so many of us who have been doing that, and it's a real crime that we haven't been able to stop it. But I would say how we react to this live streaming of a genocide matters a lot. We haven't stopped the genocide, but the silver lining of it may be that we can contribute to building the tools that will stop future genocides. These tools that we've been given by people like Las Casas, who dedicated their lives to building up a whole set of ideas and precedents that have at times constrained the violence, that have at times provided a set of rules that stop the worst excesses of this kind of thing. We live in a time of gangsters, right? And I think it's easy to be cynical. And it's easy to think that these ideas don't matter because we look around and it just looks like power wins, right?
Yeah, it looks like the United States is bullying everyone else. Russia is bullying Ukraine. Israel is bullying Gaza.
And it's important to underline that isn't new, that almost not every historical period, but most historical periods that you look at and you're going to see that kind of bullying by the most powerful. But the powerful also need a certain level of legitimacy. Illegitimate power can't continue forever. And precedent actually matters a whole lot. I think anybody who's ever worked in Washington, D.C. or some other power center with a legislature or with an executive branch, or really anybody who's ever worked in a power center will recognize the power of precedent. It's amazing once you start looking at the laws that get passed, how they rhyme with laws that went previously.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason our whole judicial system is based on the principle of precedent determining a lot of judicial actions.
Even somebody like Trump, who it feels to us like it's so disorienting what he's doing. He's doing all these new things. Like, let's take Trump saying that he wants to annex Greenland. That seems crazy. But a lot of that is Trump is actually just making political theater out of things that were already a bipartisan kind of accepted thing. For a long, long time, both parties in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans, have seen Greenland as an important part of sort of the sphere of influence of the United States. This goes back to FDR. I was just reading actually in Grandin's book that during World War II, he went to all these academics asking them to sort of draw the lines of what constituted North America. And he really, really wanted Greenland included in that for security reasons. And they came up with a complicated reason. It's called like the I forget, the widest channel theory. And it's about like the body of water that is the widest. I don't know. It's a crazy like little set of rules. But FDR got a map that includes Greenland as part of North America, which allowed him to sort of apply the Monroe Doctrine, which is this rule that the United States made that said no European power can come into the Americas. We're going to be the power here. This is our sphere of influence. Everybody else get out.
Which is ridiculous because Greenland is owned by Denmark.
Right, part of Denmark, right. But just to say, like, even Trump in that case, he is resting on some precedent. He's making political theater out of it. He's making it seem crazy. But it was actually established policy already that the United States could militarily intervene in Greenland whenever it felt threatened.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason we have military installations and bases on the island.
And, if you go back to D.C. and the power of precedent, look at the filibuster. The fact that you need 60 votes in the Senate to pass most legislation, that's not written in the Constitution anywhere. That's a precedent on how the Senate acts. They could choose not to do it, but it's hard for them not to do it because of the power of precedent and the power of rules.
Could you explain how they could choose not to do it?
Yeah. The Senate Majority Leader could just accept a vote of 51 as having passed something despite another senator's filibuster, and it would end just like that. But it would end for both parties. They know that when the other party gets a majority, a simple majority that doesn't get to 60 votes, that they'll be constrained by the filibuster. And there's all kinds of power that lines up behind these precedents because there's a lot of interests out there that don't really want Congress to be able to do much, right?
Yeah.
So keeping it as a largely impotent body, he's not having a lot of powers, constrains the majority so we can't get all the good stuff that we want as the majority of people in this country. All these executive orders that Trump is issuing, he's got lawyers, he's resting on precedent. He's trying to push the precedent. But, in his immigration roundups, he's using ICE, which already existed. He's not the first to deport people based on their political beliefs. That power already exists. It exists under the Espionage Act. Woodrow Wilson deported huge numbers of socialists and anarchists and other political radicals. But also just people's ideas are constrained and empowered by what's already happened and these ideological tools that have been built, painfully built over the years that I do think we should see the value of.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what Grandin's book, America, is like all about. So you can see this guy, Las Casas, just dedicates his life to building up both a document, just documenting the atrocities, but building up a set of ideas and principles that eventually go towards humanism and international law. I mean, you think about the things that have been built in the course of all of the colonial violence that happened and all the world wars and so on. I mean, one of them is like just the idea of independence, that people ought to have sovereignty, right? And now sovereignty is like invested in these nation states that we've built. Just like this guy, Thomas Paine, wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, was hugely influential in leading the English colonists towards independence. There were similar kinds of things that were written in Spanish America that led the Spanish colonies to their independence. I mean, I think sometimes we call this independence idea anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism. And, it comes twinned with maybe a sometimes evil twin called nationalism, because it's the independence of nation states. But that's in our toolbox. Independence is in our toolbox. Emancipation, right? We had millions and millions and millions of African slaves taken into this industrial style slavery over decades. And at the same time as that happened, the idea of emancipating people from that kind of bondage, the idea of abolition grew and grew. And it grew here in the United States. We've all know that story. But it also grew in Spanish America, in Portuguese America, over in Europe. And it grew so much to the point that slavery is now considered illegitimate completely. The power of those kind of rules being and the power of those kinds of struggles that put the rules into effect.
Yeah, and universally illegitimate, right? Almost universally illegitimate. You had a population so divided that there had to be a civil war in the United States to end it. But, now you look at most of the figures on the right, on the left, they would say this is complete disaster of human rights and of these ideas that it violated.
Mm-hmm. And then international law itself, it's under attack right now. So again, easy to be cynical about, but it has mattered in the past and it will matter again. It's striking how much international law was built through the efforts of people in Latin America. You know, when the Spanish republics all became independent from Spain, they sort of all became independent countries at the same time together. And they had to immediately learn how to live with each other. And so they created kind of the first league of independent republics. It's different from what happened in the United States with the 13 colonies, because they sort of became one country under first a loose federation, but pretty quickly a stronger federation.
Yeah.
It's different from what happened in Europe, because people will like point to earlier things that happened. Like there was this Treaty of Westphalia and say, well, that was the first example of like a league of nations, but they weren't nations. They were monarchies. They were empires. And they didn't have the same kind of sense of fixed borders. They were like loose networks of power, I would say, with, you know, ships going all over the place during colonialism. They would create these companies that, you know, like the Dutch East India Company, the Dutch West India Company, that would go out and do colonialist things. They had various grants to pirates or to settlers and all this kind of thing, but they were kind of loose networks. But the Spanish republics, like Mexico and Colombia and Venezuela and Argentina and so on, well, they came into existence as nations with fixed borders. And so they developed systems of sovereign nationhood that explicitly rejected the right of conquest, for example. So there wouldn't be wars between these neighboring countries over pieces of land. And so in the build-up towards World War I and World War II, and I think maybe a lot of us in school learned about the role that the United States played first under Woodrow Wilson in World War I, trying to create the League of Nations, which ultimately failed but led into World War II to the United Nations. Woodrow Wilson and then FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt in World War II, were hugely affected first by their experience in Latin America.
How so?
You know, it's amazing to me how much Woodrow Wilson, for example, sided with the revolutionaries during the Mexican Revolution, at least early on. He thought that Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa, right? Pancho Villa, as you know, the bandit of northern Mexico, how much he sided with these guys against the oligarchs that they were rebelling against in Mexico. And it's astounding because at the time, it's estimated that a half of all private property owned in Mexico was owned by U.S. citizens.
Yeah, you would think that the American government would step in pretty quickly in a situation like that, but no.
Yeah, and the capitalists were clamoring for it. And Wilson held them off because he was inspired by the ideals. And he was participating in these Pan-American conferences where the Latin American republics were pushing back against the United States. They were sometimes pushing back against that Monroe Doctrine I was talking about. But the Monroe Doctrine itself was not something that the Latin Americans were always against. In fact, when it was first announced, they cheered because it was basically the United States saying to Spain, hey, let these republics become independent. You have no business interfering. And at various times, it's been seen that way as a way for American nations, including the Anglo-American nation of the United States, to live together. And so Wilson and his government was participating in all these Pan-American conferences where they were talking directly to diplomats from all the Latin American countries, and they were getting these ideas, and they believed in the ideas. They were being convinced that this was the way forward, that they could create a neighborhood of friendly nations, and then that they could extend that model internationally and stop the horrors of World War I and World War II. The same with Franklin Delano Roosevelt 30 years later. He and his government were participating in this. I mean, in fact, the New Deal gained new life from this idea of the good neighbor. There was a good neighbor policy here within the United States, but also a good neighbor policy with all the Latin American countries. And it was that way of talking about human interaction, both domestically and internationally, that gave a lot of the power and legitimacy to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's re-election campaigns, and that he ultimately brought to the global level at the United Nations, in building the United Nations. All right, let's just talk about some other toolkits that we got over this history. Social democracy, with lots of limits on the absolute right to property. And the idea that social democracy is essential to beating fascism. The Latin American countries were the first to have social rights like the right to health care, the right to land, the right to be able to earn a living enshrined in their constitutions. Other things, obviously anti-genocide. The articulation of the word genocide happened in 1944. Like the concept of genocide was invented in 1944 to describe what the Nazis had done in the Holocaust. And identifying genocide as the terrible, maybe the worst crime is hugely important. And it's why we have to continue to insist on it as it's happening now in Gaza. So, after World War II, we got other really important things. We got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which includes political and civil human rights, the kind of negative human rights that we're used to, like in our Bill of Rights. The government shall not search without a warrant, that kind of thing. But it also enshrines social human rights, economic human rights. And those things were pushed for by Latin American countries the hardest.
Yeah, if you do look at this document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it includes like some very progressive provisions that the United States may not have in its constitution or its laws even, but like you said, a lot of Latin American countries do.
I could totally get behind a campaign to have a constitutional amendment guaranteeing health care as a right to everybody in this country. I think that could be worth doing. And the Human Rights Declaration is a tool in our toolbox because international opinion has already gone there, and there's already this framework that's laid out for us. Some of us grew up with certain of these principles sort of deeply ingrained within us. I think some of us who grew up within certain communities that have experienced oppression either right now or in the past are sort of like the special carriers of some of these ideas. I know that growing up as an Irish American, I grew up with a deep sense that the British had done an evil thing in colonizing and oppressing the Irish people. And, I was struck reading again, America, because in the 1500s, when Spain was unleashing the violence of the conquest in the Americas, England wasn't there yet. Like England was this backwater compared to the mighty Spanish monarchy. But they wanted to get there. They had ambitions. And the first step that they were taking was to pacify their own islands as they thought of them. And so they undertook to pacify Ireland, and they were reading De las Casas, this priest who had articulated what the Spanish were doing in the conquest, and they were using that in two ways. They were saying, man, what Las Casas was doing, that is some evil crap. The Spanish are worse than us. So anything that we do, if we're displacing the Spanish, that's going to be better. But they were also using it as like a how-to manual and applying those techniques to the Irish, decimating villages, massacres, using starvation as a weapon of war, and so on.
These were all things that were pioneered by the Spanish.
Yeah, and then picked up by the British in Ireland. And so I feel like growing up, I have this deep sense, maybe just from being told these things as a child, that I want to carry forward like a strong anti-colonialism. And I resonate with the images I see coming out of Ireland. I mean, the Catholics in Ireland, especially the Catholics in Northern Ireland, who have most recently experienced this kind of violence from a invading group of people, or from, I shouldn't say an invading group of people, because a lot of them have been there for a long time, but certainly the descendants of settlers who were settled up in Northern Ireland, Protestants from Britain, were settled in Northern Ireland. And lo and behold, the settlers in Northern Ireland identify with the Israelis, and the Catholics, the indigenous Irish, identify with the Gazans, with the Palestinians.
Yeah, you see this too in places like, South Africa, which was very recently, in terms of history, under a brutal apartheid regime, and they identify very strongly with the Palestinian cause too, and have even sued Israel and the ICJ for committing genocide.
The ICJ being the International Court of Justice.
Yes,
one of these institutions that rose up after World War II. Yeah, and you mentioned, actually, I went to mention anti-apartheid as one of these ideas. I think the civil rights movement here in the United States is an anti-apartheid movement. And certainly anti-apartheid is an important idea, and one that applies in Israel and Palestine today.
Yeah, especially we see that in the West Bank. in an ever-intensifying fashion after October 7th.
And before October 7th, it was already there. I mean, Jimmy Carter wrote a book called Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, back in 2006, almost 20 years ago. Black Americans who experienced the civil rights movement, who experienced Jim Crow, who experienced all the horrors after Reconstruction was defeated after the Civil War, they're the special carriers of an anti-apartheid movement here in the United States. And I don't think this has to be like a racial or ethnic thing, just because I'm Irish or just because somebody's African American, that we're the special holders, although I do think being raised in that community gives you those tools, but it's a community of ideas, of people who feel these things deeply. And just by participating in the movement for justice for Palestinians, for an end to the genocide, for an end to the apartheid, we're building and constructing these things. And in a time when Trump seems to be just tearing down international law, and the generations that can remember the absolutely apocalyptic violence of World War II, well, those generations aren't with us anymore. So it's incumbent on us to be telling the stories and to be breathing life into these ideas and to continue to enforce them, so that even if we can't end the violence today, we're putting force into these ideas that could help constrain the violence and have less violence in the future. Because, in a world with artificial intelligent robots and drones and nuclear weapons, without rules of engagement, without a humanism, the future could be very dark indeed. And I think it's important to understand what we're dealing with. Like, the first big blow by the United States to this system that they created after World War II, I think you got to look to what happened in 1986. So there was a revolution in Nicaragua of the Sandinistas, and they were like a social democratic reform revolutionary movement. They wanted a lot of the same things that you see throughout social democracies in Latin America, starting maybe with the Mexican Revolution, but things like the right to good housing, to a living, to food, to health. And the Cold Warriors under Reagan just went in an absolute religious war against them. They funded this groups called the Contras, unleashed the same kinds of horrors that I've described for the Spanish conquest in Gaza. And Nicaragua brought a case against the Reagan administration in the International Court of Justice, which you just mentioned in the context of Gaza. And Nicaragua won that case. They said that what the Reagan administration with the United States was doing against the government of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua was illegal. They were mining the ports. They were inflicting all of this violence. And Nicaragua asked for $14 billion in restitution. And the response of the Reagan administration was to pull out of the International Court of Justice. Fast forward to George W. Bush's illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq, bypassing the United Nations, then to Biden's support for the genocide in Gaza.
Yeah, and the U.S. has a law that we've passed called the Hague Invasion Act, which states that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which tries individuals for war crimes, if any American is tried in that court, the United States is immediately authorized to invade where the ICC is located, which is, this crazy concept and this crazy subversion of international law.
And now Trump is just ripping it to shreds in front of everybody and, making a lot of political theater out of doing so. But it's not the first dark moment we've faced. And every time there's been a dark moment, there's also been a counter movement that's risen up against it. And that's why I would say reading Grandin's book, even though it's an account of some absolute horrors, it's maybe the most optimistic book from him in particular, but it's one of the more optimistic books that I've read dealing with history, because you realize that over the course of this history, not only did horrors happen, but you have had a rising tide of humanist thought, of humanist ideas, and the application of those ideas. So I highly recommend, if you're looking for a book to read, pick up America. I guarantee you're going to learn a lot of stuff. It is so readable. It's just such a wonderful book. Like, every chapter could sort of be read by itself. He's just got some amazing stories in there. It's not like a sort of typical history from a Yale professor where you're slogging through it. It's really fun to read. And I guess the call to action that I'd say is coming to us from Latin America. As Greg Grandin puts it, the call is to, quote, answer every bloody body with ever more adamant affirmations of humanity. And that I think is why we talk so much and care so much about what's happening today in Gaza. Free Palestine.
Free Palestine.
Thanks.